Hello ladies, welcome to Homemaking Radio. I've designed these little videos for you to listen to as you work. You know, people that love radio are also people who love to accomplish things, who love to get in there and do things and love the satisfaction of getting something finished. And I love videos. I love to watch the decorating videos and the cleaning videos, but you have to stop and look, and that's one reason I don't do a live stream, is I'd have to stop and look and you'd have to stop and comment. So this way you can listen as you go, but I always show you my teacup first. And today I'm showing you, I'm recycling these, so those of you who have been with me since 2005 have seen this before. But it's a blue teacup and it has a marking on it that says Duchess. Looks like it came from the 1960s or 70s. And my sister-in-law in Australia gave it to me, so thank you, Eva, if you're watching. And it's just so cheerful, so beautiful. It has yellow roses, and then you turn it around, it has a really pretty pink one, and the plate is lovely, and I just love it. But before you go, I want to show you a couple of other things, and then I'll let you go while I read to you today. And I mentioned Yorkshire Gold tea. It comes in a box that's gold. Has a picture of, I believe, Yorkshire Dales there with the chalks and the downs. And then I wanted to show you maybe something that you might see in our grocery stores here in the U.S. I get mine at a Whole Foods market. They supply this. And I wanted to show you something that you're going to see that's cheaper, that's at a grocery store by the same company, and it's called Yorkshire tea. But don't be fooled by it. It doesn't taste like this. This is a tea made with, I'm trying to think if it was Kenyan, Rwandan, and some other. It's just a wonderful blend that's gold. I mean, the tea actually looks gold when you drink it. It's very mild, but almost tastes like milk. It's just beautiful, and we drink it black here in the U.S. I'm trying to think what it was, but this one here, no, I don't care for it. It seems cheaper, it's not as good, and if you're a tea drinker, you'll know that. Now, some people don't mind it because they load their tea up with milk and sugar, and we don't. So we're more likely to taste every little nuance, of the tea. So I wanted to show you that, but this is what you'll get. It's about $4.95 a box, and they're tea bags, and I don't make mine in a pot if I'm alone. If I'm having a tea gathering, I will make it in a teapot. They like it made that way. But at home, I dip my tea bag in it, in my cup of hot tea all day long, and the tea bag can last me all day. But if I make it in a pot and there's just me here, or just my husband and I here, I find that tea goes cold, and we don't drink it fast enough, so you have to add hot water. It just doesn't taste the same. So I just wanted you to see that, and then I'm going to show you one more thing and let you go. Now, we talked about letter writing and how to fold the letter, and I want to, and how to, stuff the envelope. And so today I want to talk to you about envelopes, and the best kinds you can get, you'll have to check, these came from the Dollar Tree, are the ones you peel off like that, and then that sticks automatically. And of course, the old-fashioned way of licking the envelope just has to go by the way. You can't do that anymore. And this is one of those that has that on it. So the solution to that is you go to the Dollar Tree and you get a package of sponges. And you get yourself a little bowl from your kitchen, or, Dollar Tree has these too. And you fill it, put water in it, a little bit of water in it. And I took my sponge today and I cut it into a shape like this. And you will set that in this little bowl like this, and it will soak up a little water. And then when you get ready to seal this, you just take it. It has to be almost dry. You can't get it too wet. And you put this, just kind of wipe it across there, okay, so that you never have to lick an envelope. And then people that open it don't have to worry about it. However, I have heard that you can get very valuable DNA off of old letters, and I would love to get my father's DNA, and I don't know if that works or not, but if so, I've got all his letters, lots of his letters. I have my mother's DNA, but I don't have my father's, and I'd really like to get that. If that's true, that's great. Well, today, ladies, I'm going to read to you, and I'm going to read When Queens Ride By and The Wife. And these are two books that were written way back in the olden days. And so I'm going to read the earliest one first, which is When Queens Ride By. First, I'm going to read you a poem, all right? And I wanted to tell you all, before we go any further, that you can come out of at the other end of a crisis either a wiser and a more stable person, or you can come out of a crisis even more rattled than ever before, depending on how you look at it and what you do. And also, it's a great test of faith. And so I want to read this poem. I used this with my children when they were growing up, when we were homeschooling, because, you know, you're more in tune as a mother to their countenance, to the look on their face, to whether they're kind of lagging or whether they're discouraged. You're more in tune with it. And so you have to give them equipment to handle life. Life is part good and part bad. That's the way it is. We'll get sick. We'll get well. There will be problems, but that's life. And so we need to teach everybody to cope with it. And this was one of the earliest poems, and I believe this was probably written in the 1800s. It was in it was either in an old McGuffey reader, or it was in the art literature readers, which we got they were reprints, which we got in the 1980s. So I'm going to read this to you. How to be happy. You may go and start your work. You can start loading the dishwasher, unloading it, ironing. One day I will iron. I will announce it, and then you can iron while I iron. And which is one of my favorite things. You know, I've been well when other people have been sick because I use a steam iron, and I iron often. Plus, I drink tea all day long, all different kinds. I have my berry tea that I like to drink, that I just put berries in here and put hot water over them. And I use lemon honey drinks. I do hot drinks all day. They flush toxins out of your body and viruses. And in this day and age, you ought to be drinking that all day long. You ought to have a collection of teacups to drink them out of, and you ought to be celebrating life every cup of the way. So here is the little poem, I believe, written in the late 1800s. You know, they had a lot of... If I could kick from rattling off at the mouth, I could probably get this read, but I thought of something, and with me, if a thought enters my mind, if I don't capture it and talk about it, it's like gone with the wind. But in the 1800s, they had their wars and rumors of wars. They had their newspaper scandals, and sometimes a newspaper would even invent a war to sell papers, a war that didn't even exist, because, of course, no one could check it out. You know, it would be something in Central America or South America, and nobody could check it out. And they even competed with each other to see who could have the most outrageous and sensational, scandalized titles so that they could sell newspapers. And we used to call them rags. We used to call them yellow rags because they were made of rag paper. And also, something about a newspaper that maybe you did not know. You can go to work now. You don't have to. I don't have anything to show you, so there's nothing to watch here. But they started. The printers would charge according to how many pages there were in a paper or a publication. So the newspaper publishers figured out they could have one sheet of paper that big and get all their stuff printed on it, and then they would just fold it, and it would be cheaper. And so that's how those huge newspapers came about. It was just cheaper. So how to be happy. Now, I want to warn you, before you let someone listen to this, before you read this to anybody, before you tell them about this poem, you can look it up. It's on the web, How to Be Happy, poem, How to Be Happy. That there are some people that enjoy their little cloud of gloom so much that they do not want any hope. They do not want any happiness because they love that comfortable little... did you remember Charles Schulz had a what they call a cartoon strip in the newspaper every week, and he had a little character called Pigpen, and Pigpen would walk around with this big cloud of dust around him. Well, that's the way these naysayers, doom and gloomers are. If you come and you've got an answer or a solution or want to give them hope, they will probably want to stone you the way they wanted to stone Aaron when he told them they could take the land. Remember that story I told you the last time? And so some people are just not ready for hope, and it might just anger them because they think that you're not being realistic, or they think you're not being serious if you offer hope. But just because we offer you hope does not mean we're not serious. about whatever this is going on, okay? And I know that a lot of you have probably lost friends over this whole situation. If you have determined to look on the bright side and turn to the Lord for all of your moods and answers, because they don't want it, and I've lost votes myself. So, how to be happy? Are you almost disgusted with life, little man? I'll tell you a wonderful trick that will bring you contentment if anything can. Do something for somebody quick. Are you awfully tired with play, little girl, wearied, discouraged, and sick? I'll tell you the loveliest game in the world. Do something for somebody quick. Though it rains like the rain of the flood, little man, and the clouds are forbidding and thick, you can make some sunshine on your soul, little man. Do something for somebody quick. Though the stars are like brass overhead, little girl, and the walks like a well-heated brick, and our earthly affairs in a terrible whirl, do something for somebody quick. Now, I read this to my children when they were quite young, and we were way out on a farm in Texas, and we could go places, but there came days, when you just pretty much had to stay home because of the heat or because it just was more economical, and we also wanted, to have a home life, and we were homeschooling. And when I read that to them, and if they ever got to where they were bored or they became discontent, I said, we'll just do something for somebody. Well, there were only all the children and myself and my husband out there, so they had so much fun with this. They would cut little pictures out of catalogs, magazines, whatever we had that we could give them, and even off of boxes. Like on the box of butter, there was a little cow on it, and then on the box of flour, there was a little wheat thing there. And what they would do, or in the catalogs, especially at Christmas, there were toys. They would cut these things out, the toys and gift catalogs, and they would cut them out and put them on cardboard. And the cardboard was from the inside of a cereal box, or from, we had cardstock in those days, or from old greeting cards. We would use what was on old greeting cards, and we found resources everywhere. And they would glue them on. And then they would make a little box out of cardboard too, and put all these little gifts in the box. I still have some of those little boxes of gifts that we passed down the tradition to the grandchildren, and the grandchildren made me some. They were beautiful. I got a diamond ring, and I got a fresh bouquet of flowers, and I got a new dress, and I got a car. They were so much fun, and we just absorbed ourselves in it. I sat there with them and started it, making it, and so we decided to give each other presents. Another thing they would do is wrap up a toy that they liked, wrap it up in a dish towel and tie it with string, and then give it to somebody. Of course, they didn't know what it was. It was such a surprise to open it up and see the toy car, the toy doll. Of course, we gave it all back, but this was the fun of learning to do something for somebody else. And whenever one of them sensed that one of us, even me, was just a little bit blue or discouraged, and I hate to say blue because I love blue. I like blue. So there's no such thing as Blue Monday because it's a wonderful day. This is Monday. I'm broadcasting to you on Monday, and it's a wonderful day. And so whenever somebody in the family felt a little bit, and we could detect one another's moods by their face, by their eyes, by the way they were, by their posture, and we would do something for them. And what a difference it made when somebody would hand you a little gift all wrapped up, even if it was just something pasted on cardboard, and how much we liked that. And so now, ladies, I'm going to set up another story for you, and it's called When Queens Ride By, and I'm going to label this so that other people that aren't in this blog will find it and have it read to them, because I don't know if it's on Leverbox or not, but I have my own way of reading it. And I also want to set up the story for you too. All right, I like to tell what to look for. So what I want you to look for in this is, first of all, I want to tell you that it wasn't originally called When Queens Ride By, and it was a play that was written in response to a contest. And the lady who won it was Agnes Slight Turnbull, and was written in 1888. and it became very popular for women's sewing classes, Bible classes, because what it was about, and it wasn't originally called When Queens Ride By. And it's unfortunate that it is called that. It was called another real complicated name, like what to do in, that the sentence was quite long, what to do in adverse circumstances, and it just, in those days, they were quite wordy. We're more blunt today. And but the reason it's called When Queens Ride By is because this dramatic story of a queen in there. And so I want to set this up for you, and I want you to look for something. We see a very discouraged housewife, homemaker. She's a farm wife, and she's trying to get some things done on the farm, and she's neglecting her housework and her appearance, and somebody stops by with a flat tire just in front of the fence in her by her farm, and comes up to talk to her while her husband and another man fix the tire. And it changed her life. The message changed her life. Now, of course, today, if you tried to talk to somebody like that, they'd probably punch you in the face, because they don't want courage. They don't want hope. They don't want happiness. They're happy in their pig pen bubble of dust and dismay, and it's comfortable to them. And in hard times, like I said, you're either going to come out happier and brighter and more stable, or you're going to come out worse, because that now you have the wounds to get over, you see, and then you're going to heap that all up on yourself and carry these burdens around. But this is a wonderful story, and if you will open your heart to it and open your mind to it, it'll make you a better person, and you'll have success. Are you interested in success? That's the thing. Are you interested in success as a homemaker? Are you interested in success as a mother and a wife? Are you interested in success as an entrepreneur? Are you interested in success as an ambassador to your church, to your home, and to your nation? That's what you are. Wherever you go, you represent something. You represent your husband, you represent your family, you represent your home, you represent your values, you represent the church you belong to, and you are a representative. That is what an ambassador is. The Bible calls us as Christians as ambassadors, and you're an ambassador of your country. That's why I said in my last video, we don't run down my country here. And I don't know if you remember an old song about that written in the, I believe, 1960s. And we don't run it down, because we are our country. If you're running my country down, you're running me down, because I am the country. We are the country, and I'm running it. I'm running it today, and we do believe we are running it. We are part of it, because of the freedom that we have. But we don't have license. Freedom is not the same as license. Freedom does not mean you mouth off about any old thing and swear at people and call the president a nasty name, even if you don't like him. I haven't liked presidents for 40 years. I haven't liked the presidents, but I never allowed my children to joke about them, or to run them in the ground, or to make rude remarks about them, because I wanted God's blessings on our lives. And we are told in the Bible what to do about magistrates and kings and people in power. You're to pray for them. And you're to live a good, clean life, and you're to. There were several other things. I mentioned it in a previous article. I do want to quit talking and get on with this. Okay, so this When Queens Ride By, this is such a. Now, of course, it was written in 1888, so they were a bit different with their words, a bit wordy, but I'm going to try to read it with expression so that you can see what's going on here, okay? And I'm going to try not to stop and explain it to you. Okay. When Queens Ride by Agnes Slight Turnbull, 1888. I'm not sure if this was British or American, but it's all American to me, because that's the way Americans are. We are a can-do people. With hope. Jenny Musgrove woke at the shrill rasp of the alarm clock, as she always woke, with a shuddering start and a heavy realization that the brief respite of the night's oblivion was over. She had only time to glance through the dull light at the cluttered, dusty room, and before John's voice was saying sleepily, as he said every morning, "All right, let's go. It doesn't seem as if we'd been in bed at all." Jenny dressed quickly in the clothes, none too clean, that, exhausted, she had flung from her the night before. She hurried down the back stairs, her coarse shoes clattering thickly upon the bare boards. She kindled the fire in the range, and then made a hasty pretense at washing in the basin in the sink. John strode through the kitchen and on out to the barn. There were 6 cows to be milked, and the great cans of milk to be taken to the station for the morning train. Jenny put coffee and bacon on the stove, and then, catching up a pail from the porch, went after John. A golden red disk broke the misty blue of the morning above the cow pasture. A sweet, fragrant breath blew from the orchard, but Jenny neither saw nor felt the beauty around her. She glanced at the sun and thought, "It's going to be a hot day." She glanced at the orchard, and her brows knit. There it hung, all that fruit, bushels of it going to waste. Maybe she could get time that day to make some more apple butter. But the tomatoes wouldn't wait. She must pick them and get them to town today, or that would be a dead loss. After all her work, well, it would only be in a piece with everything else if it didn't happen so. She and John had had bad luck, and they might as well make up their minds to it. She finished her part of the milking, and hurried back again to the overcooked bacon and strong coffee. The children were down, clamorous, dirty, always underfoot. Jim, the eldest, was in the first term of school. She glanced at his spotted waist. He should have a clean one, but she couldn't help it. She couldn't get the washing done last week, and when she was to get a day for it this week, she didn't know, with all the picking and the trips to town to make. Breakfast was hurried and unpalatable, a sort of grudging concession to the demands of the body. Then John left in the milk wagon for the station, and Jenny packed little Jim's lunch basket with bread and apple butter and pie, left the 2 little children to their own devices in the backyard, and started towards the barn. There was no time to do anything in the house. The chickens and turkeys had to be attended to, and then she must get to the tomato patch before the sun got too hot. Behind her was the orchard, with its rows and rows of laden apple trees. Maybe this afternoon, maybe tomorrow morning, she would do it. There were potatoes, too, to be lifted. Too hard work for a woman, but what were you going to do? Starve? John worked till dark in the fields. She pushed her hair back with a quick, boyish sweep of her arm, and went on scattering the grain to the fowls. She remembered their eager plans when they were married, when they took over the old farm, laden with its heavy mortgage, that had been John's father's. John had been so straight of back then and so jolly, only 7 years, yet now he was stooped a little, and his brows were always drawn, as though to hide a look of ashamed failure. They had planned to have a model farm some day, blooded stock, a tractor, a new barn, and then such a home they were to make of the old stone house. Makes me happy thinking about that. Jenny's hopes had flared higher even than John's. A rug for the parlor, an overstuffed set like the one in the mail order catalog, linoleum for the kitchen, electric lights. They were young and oh so strong. There was nothing they could not do, if they only worked hard enough. But that great faith had dwindled as the first year passed. John worked later and later in the evenings. Jenny looked more and more haggard as the heavy tasks were upon her own shoulders. She often thought with some pride that no woman in the countryside ever helped her husband as much as she did. Even with the haying and riding the reaper, hard, coarsening work, but she was glad to do it for John's sake. The sad riddle of it all was that at the end of each year they were no further on. The only difference from the year before was another window shutter hanging from one hinge, and another crippled wagon in the barnyard, which John never had time to mend. They puzzled over it in a vague distress, and meanwhile life degenerated into a straining, hopeless struggle. Sometimes lately John had seemed a little listless, as though nothing mattered, a little bitter when he spoke of Henry Davis. Henry held the mortgage and had expected a payment on the principal this year. He had come once and looked about with something very like a sneer on his face. If he should decide some day to foreclose, that would be the final blow. They would never get up after that. If John couldn't hold the old farm, he could never try to buy a new one. It would mean being renters all their lives. Poor renters at that. She went into the tomato field. It had been her own idea to do some tracking along with the regular farm crops. But, like everything else, it failed of her expectations. As she put on the scarlet tomatoes, just a little overripe, into the basket, she glanced with hard tightening of her lips toward a break in the trees, a half a mile away, where a dark, listening bit of road caught the sun. Across its polished surface twinkled an endless procession of shining, swift-moving objects. The state highway. Yeah, now I know this isn't America. Jenny hated it. In the first place, it was so tauntingly near and yet so hopelessly far from them. If it only ran by their door, as it did past Henry Davis's, for instance, it would solve the whole problem of marketing the fruits and vegetables. Then they could set the baskets on the lawn and people could just stop for them. But as it was, nobody all summer long had paid the least attention to the sign John had put up at the end of the lane. And no wonder. Why should travelers drive their cars over the stony country by the way, when a little further along they could find the same fruits spread temptingly for them at the very roadside? But there was another reason she hated that bit of sleek road showing between the trees. She hated it because it hurt her with its suggestion of all that passed by her in the endless procession twinkling in the sunlight. There they kept going, day after day, those happy, carefree women, riding in handsome limousines or in gay little roadsters. Some in plainer cars, too, but even those were, like the others, women who could have a rest, pleasure, and comfort for the asking. They were whirled along hour by hour to new pleasures, while she was weighted to the drudgery of the farm like one of the great rocks of the pasture field. And, most bitter thought of all, they had pretty homes to go back to when the happy journey was over. That seemed to be the strange and cruel law about homes. The finer they were, the easier it was to leave them. Now with her, if she had the rug for the parlor, and the stuffed furniture, and the linoleum for the kitchen, she shouldn't mind anything so much then. She had nothing but hard slaving and bad luck. And the highway taunted her with it, flung its impossible pleasures mockingly in her face as she bent over the vines and dragged the heavy baskets along the rows. The sun grew hotter. Jenny put more strength into her task. She knew, at last, by the scorching heat overhead, that it was nearing noon. She must have a bit of lunch ready for John when he came in. Wasn't time to prepare much. Just reheat the coffee and set down some bread and pie. She started towards the house, giving a long, yodeling call for the children as she went. They appeared from the orchard, tumbled and torn from experiments with the wire fence. Her heart smothered her at the sight of them. Among the other dreams that the years had crushed out were these cozy little rosy boys and girls in their clean suits and fresh ruffled dresses. As it was, the children had just grown like farm weeds. This was the part of all the drudgery that hurt the most, that she had not time to care for her children, to sew for them, to teach them things that other children knew. Sometimes it seemed as if she had no real love for them at all. She was too terribly tired, as a rule, to have any feeling. The only time she used energy to talk to them was when she had to reprove them for some dangerous misdeed. That was all wrong. It seemed wicked, but how could she help it? With the work draining the very life out of her, strong as she was. John came in heavily and ate in silence, except for the children's chatter. John hardly looked up from his plate. He gulped down great draughts of the warmed-over coffee, then pushed his chair back hurriedly. "I'm going to try to finish the heroine in the south field," he said. "I'm at the tomatoes," Jenny answered. "I've got them most picked and ready for taking." That was all. Work was again upon them. It was 2 o'clock by the sun, and Jenny had loaded the last heavy basket of tomatoes on the milk wagon in which she must drive to town, when she heard the shrill voices sounding along the path. The children were flying in excitement toward her. "Mom! Mom! Mom!" Oh, it must be from England. They called as they came panting up to her with big surprised eyes. "Mom, there's a lady there at the kitchen door, all dressed up, a pretty lady. She wants to see you." Jenny gazed down at them disbelievingly. A lady? A pretty lady at her kitchen door? All dressed up? What could that mean? Was it possible someone had at last braved the stony lane to buy fruit? Maybe bushels of it. "Did she come in a car?" Jenny asked quickly. "No, she just walked in. She's awfully pretty. She smiled at us." Jenny's hopes dropped. Of course, she might have known. Some agent likely, selling books. She followed the children wearily back along the path, and in the rear door of the kitchen. Across from it another door opened into the side yard. Here stood the stranger. The two women looked at each other across the kitchen, across the table with the remains of 2 meals upon it, the strewn chairs, the littered stove, across the whole scene of unlovely disorder. They looked at each other in startled surprise, as inhabitants of Earth and Mars might look as they were suddenly brought face to face. Jenny saw a woman in a gray tweed coat that seemed to be part of her straight, slim body. A small gray hat with a rose quill was drawn low over the brownish hair. Her blue eyes were clear and smiling. She was beautiful, and yet she was not young. She was in her 40s, surely, but an aura of eager youth clung to her, a clean and exquisite freshness. The stranger in her turn looked across at the young woman, haggard and weary. Her yellowish hair hung in straggling wisps. Her eyes looked hard and hunted. Her cheeks were thin and sallow. Her calico dress was shapeless and begrimed from her work. So they looked at each other for one long, appraising second. Then the woman in gray smiled. "How do you do?" she began. "We ran our car into the shade of your lane to have our lunch and rest for a while, and I walked up to buy a few apples from you, if you have them." Jenny stood staring at the stranger. There was an unconscious hostility in her eyes. This was one of the women from the highway, one of those envied ones who passed twinkling through the summer sunshine, from pleasure to pleasure, while Jenny slaved on. But the pretty lady's smile was disarming. Jenny started toward a chair and pulled off the old coat and apron that lay on it. "Won't you sit down?" she said politely. "I'll go and get the apples. I'll have to pick them off a tree. Would you prefer Rambo's?" "I don't know what they are, but they sound delicious. You must choose them for me. But mayn't I come with you? I should love to help pick them." Jenny considered. She felt baffled by the friendliness of the other woman's face, and utterly unable to meet it. But she did not know how to refuse. "Why, I suppose so, if you could get through the dirt." She led the way over the back porch, with its crowded baskets and pails and coal buckets, along with the unkept path toward the orchard. She had never been so acutely conscious of the disorder around her. Now a hot shame brought a lump to her throat. In her preoccupied haste before, she had actually not noticed the tub of overturned milk cans and the rubbish heap. She saw it all now swiftly through the other woman's eyes. Then she knew that new perspective was checked by a bitter defiance. Why should she care how things looked to this woman? She would be gone, speeding down the highway in a few minutes, as though she had never been there. She reached the orchard and began to drag a long ladder from the fence to the Rambo tree. The other woman cried out in distress. "Oh, but you can't do that. You mustn't. It's too heavy for you, or even for both of us. Please, just let me pick a few from the ground." Jenny looked in amazement at the stranger's concern. It was so long since she had seen anything like it. "Heavy?" she repeated. "This ladder? I wish I didn't ever have to lift anything heavier than this ladder. After hoisting bushels of baskets of tomatoes onto a wagon, this feels light to me." The stranger caught her arm. But do you think it's right? Why, that's a man's work." Jenny's eyes blazed. Something furious and long-pent broke out from within her. "Right? Who are you to be asking me whether I'm right or not? What would have become of us if I didn't do a man's work? It takes us both slaving away, and then we get nowhere. A person like you don't know what work is. You don't know." Jenny's voice was the high shrill of hysteria. But the stranger's low tones somehow broke through. "Listen," she said soothingly. "Please listen to me. I'm sorry I annoyed you by saying that. But now, since we are talking, why can't we sit down here and rest a minute? It's so cool and lovely under the trees, and if you were to tell me all about it, because I'm only a stranger, perhaps it would help. It does sometimes, you know. A little rest would—" "Rest? Me sit down to rest, and the wagon loaded to go to town? I'll hurry me now to get back before dark." And then something strange happened. The other woman put her cool, soft hand on Jenny's grimy arm. There was a compelling tenderness in her eyes. "Just take the time you would have spent picking apples. I would so much rather, and perhaps somehow I could help you. I wish I could. Won't you tell me why you have to work so hard?" Jenny sat down on the smooth green grass. Her hunted, unwilling eyes had yielded to some power in the clear, serene eyes of the stranger. A sort of exhaustion came over her, a trembling reaction from the straining efforts of weeks of work. "There ain't much to tell," she said half sullenly, "only that we ain't getting ahead. We're clean discouraged, both of us. Henry Davis is talking about foreclosing on us if we don't pay some principal. The time of the mortgage is out this year, and maybe he won't renew it. He's got plenty himself, but them's the hardest kind." She paused, then her eyes flared. "And it ain't that I haven't done my part. Look at me. I'm barely 30. I might as well be 50. I'm so weather-beaten. That's the way I've worked." "And do you think that has helped your husband?" asked the stranger. "Helped him?" Jenny's voice was sharp. "Why shouldn't it help him?" The stranger was looking away through the green stretches of orchard. She laced her slim hand together about her knees. Then she spoke slowly. "Men are such queer things, husbands especially. Sometimes we blunder when we are trying hardest to serve them. For instance, they want us to be economical, and yet they want us in pretty clothes. They need our work, and yet they want us to keep our youth and our beauty. And sometimes they don't know themselves which they really want most. So we have to choose. That's what makes it so hard." She paused. Jenny was watching her with dull curiosity, as though she were speaking a foreign tongue. Then the stranger went on. "I had to choose once, long ago, just after we were married. My husband decided to have his own business, so he started a very tiny one. He couldn't afford a helper, and he wanted me to stay in the office while he did the outside selling. And I refused, even though it hurt him. Oh, it was hard, but I knew how it would be if I did as he wished. We would both have come back each night, tired out, to a dark, cheerless house, and a picked-up dinner. That means takeout. And a year if that might have taken something away from us. Something precious. I couldn't risk it, so I refused and stuck to it. And then how I worked in my house, a flat it was then. I had so little outside and our wedding gifts, but at least I could make it a clean, shining, happy place. I tried to give our little dinners the grace of a feast. And as the months went on, I knew I had done right. My husband would come home dead tired and discouraged, ready to give up the whole thing. But after he had eaten and sat down in our bright little living room, I had to read to him, or told him all the funny things I could invent about my day. I could see him change. By bedtime, he had his courage back, and by morning he was at last ready to go out and fight again. And at last he won, and he won his success alone, as a man loves to do." Still Jenny could not speak. She only regarded her guest with a half-resentful understanding. The woman in gray looked off again between the trees. Her voice was very sweet. Her humorous little smile played about her lips. "There was a queen once," she went on, "who reigned in troublous days. And every time the country was on the brink of war, and the people ready to fly into a panic, she would put on her showiest dress, take her court with her, and go hunting. And when the people would see her riding by, apparently so happy, they were sure all was well with the government. So she tided over many a danger. And I've tried to be like her. Whenever a big crisis comes into my husband's business, and we've had several, or when he's discouraged, I put on my prettiest dress and get the best dinner I know how, or give a party. And somehow it seems to work. That's the woman's part, you know, to play the queen." A faint honk-honk came from the lane. The stranger started to her feet. "That's my husband. I must go. Please don't bother about the apples. I'll just take these from under the tree. We only wanted 2 or 3, really. And give these to the children." She slipped 2 coins into Jenny's hand. Jenny had risen too, and was trying from confusion of startled thoughts to select one for speech. Instead, she only answered the other woman's bright goodbye with a stammering repetition and a broken apology about the apples. She watched the stranger's erect, lithe figure hurrying away across the path that led directly to the lane. Then she turned her back to the house, wondering dazedly if she'd only dreamed that the other woman had been there. But no, there were emotions rising hotly within her that were new. She had no place an hour before. They had no place an hour before. They had risen at the words of the stranger, and at the sight of her smooth, soft hair and the fresh color in her cheeks, the happy shine of her eyes. A great wave of longing swept over Jenny, a desire that was lost in choking despair. It was as though she had heard a strain of music for which she had waited all of her life, and then felt it swept away into silence before she had grasped its beauty. For just a few brief moments, Jenny Musgrave had sat beside one of the women of the highway and caught a breath of her life, that life which forever twinkled in the past in bright procession, like the happenings of a fairy tale. Then she was gone, and Jenny was left as she had been, bound to the soil like one of the rocks of the field. The bitterness that stormed her heart now was different from the old dull disheartenment, for it was coupled with new knowledge. The words of the stranger seemed more vivid to her than when she had sat listening in the orchard, but they came back to her with the pain of agony. All very well for her to talk so smooth to me about man's work and woman's work, and what she did for her husband's big success. Easy enough for her to sit talking about queens. What would she do if she were here on the farm like me? What would a woman like her do? Jenny had reached the kitchen door and stood there looking in the hopeless melee around her. Her words sounded strange and hollow in the silence of the house. Easy for her, she burst out. She never had the work piling up over her like I have. She never felt it at the throat like a wolf, the same as John and me does. Talk about choosing. I haven't got no choice. I just got to keep going like I always have. She stopped suddenly. There in the middle of the kitchen floor, where the other woman had passed, lay a tiny square of white. Jenny crossed to it quickly and picked it up. A faint, delicious fragrance, like the dream of a flower, came from it. Jenny inhaled it eagerly. It was not like any odor she had ever known. It made her think of sweet, strange things she had never thought about before, of gardens in the early summer, of wide, fair rooms with the moonlight shining in them. It made her somehow think with vague wistfulness of that. She looked carefully at the tiny square. The handkerchief was of fine, fairy-like smoothness. In the corner a dainty blue butterfly spread its wings. Jenny drew in another long breath. The fragrance filled her senses again. Her first greedy draught had not exhausted it. It would stay for a while at least. She laid the bit of white down cautiously on the edge of the table and went to the sink, where she washed her hands carefully. Then she returned and picked up the handkerchief again, and with something like reverence. She sat down, still holding it, staring at it. This bit of linen was to her an articulated voice. She understood its language. It spoke to her of white, freshly washed clothes, blowing in the sunshine, of an iron moving smoothly, leisurely, to the accompaniment of a song over snowy folds. It spoke to her of a quiet, orderly room, and ticking clocks, and a mending basket under the evening lamp. It spoke to her of all the peaceful routine of a well-managed household, the kind she had once dreamed of having. But more than this, the exquisite daintiness of it, the sweet, alluring perfume spoke to her of something else, which her heart understood, even though her speech could have found no words for it. She could feel gropingly the delicacy, the grace, the beauty that made up the other woman's life in all its relations. She, Jenny, had none of that. Everything about their lives, hers and John's, was coarsened, soiled somehow by the dragging, endless labor of the days. Jenny leaned forward, her arms stretched tautly before her upon her knees, her hands clasped lightly over the fragrant bit of white. Suppose she were to try doing as the stranger had said. Suppose that she spent her time on the house and let the outside work go. What then? What would John say? Would they be much further behind than they were now? Could they be? And suppose by some strange chance the other woman had been right, that a man could be helped more by doing some of the other things she had neglected. She sat very still, distressed, uncertain. Out in the barnyard waited the wagon of tomatoes, overripe now for the market. No, she could do nothing today, at least, but go on as usual. Then her hands opened a little. The perfume within them came up to her, bringing again that thrill of sweet, indescribable things. She started up, half terrified at her own resolve. I'm going to try it now, maybe crazy, but I'm going to do it anyhow. It was a long time since Jenny had performed such a meticulous toilet. She was years before she had brushed her hair thoroughly. A hasty combing had been its best treatment. She put on her one clean dress, the dark voile reserved for trips to town. She even changed from her shapeless, heavy shoes to her best ones. Then she looked at herself in the dusty mirror. She saw that she had changed. Something at least of the hard haggardness was gone from her face, and her hair framed it with smooth softness. Tomorrow she would wash it. It used to be almost yellow. She went to the kitchen. With something of the burning zeal of a fanatic, she attacked the confusion before her. By 4:30 the room was clean, the floor swept, the stove shining, dishes and pans washed and put in their places. From the tumbled depths of a drawer Jenny had extracted a white tablecloth that had been bought in the early days for company only. With a spirit of daring recklessness, she spread it on the table. She polished the chimney of the big oil lamp, and then set the fixture, clean and shining, in the center of the white cloth. Now the supper. She must hurry. She planned to have it at 6 o'clock and ring the bell for John 15 minutes before, as she used to do just after they were married. She decided upon fried ham and brown potatoes and applesauce with hot biscuits. She hadn't made them for so long, but her fingers fell into their old deftness. Why, cooking was just play if you had time to do it right. Then she thought of the tomatoes and gave a little shudder. She thought of the long hours of heartbreaking work she had to put them in, and called herself a little fool for having been swayed by the words of a stranger and the scent of a handkerchief, to neglect her rightful work and bring upon more loss upon John and herself. But she went on, making biscuits, turning the ham, setting the table. It was 5:30. The first plan of flaky brown mounds had been withdrawn from the oven. The children's faces and hands had been washed and their excited questions satisfied when the sound of a car came from the bend. Jenny knew that car. It belonged to Henry Davis. He could be coming for only one thing. The blow they had dreaded, fending off by blind disbelief in the ultimate disaster, was about to fall. Henry was coming to tell them he was going to foreclose. It would almost kill John. This was his father's old farm. John had taken it over, mortgage and all, so hopefully, so sure he could succeed where his father had failed. If he had to leave now, there would be a double disgrace to bear, and where could they go? Farms weren't so plentiful. Henry had driven up to the side gate. He fumbled with the papers in his inner pocket as he started up the walk. A wild terror filled Jenny's heart. She wanted desperately to avoid meeting Henry Davis' keen, hard face, to flee somewhere, anywhere, before she heard the words that doomed them. Then, as she stood shaken, wondering how she could live through what the next hours would bring, she saw in a flash the beautiful stranger as she sat in the orchard, looking off between the trees and smiling to herself. There was once a queen. Jenny heard the words again distinctly, just as Henry Davis' steps sounded sharply nearer the walk outside. There was only a confused picture of a queen wearing the stranger's lovely, high-bred face, riding gaily to the hunt through the forests and towns where her kingdom was tottering, rolling gallantly on in spite of her fears. Jenny's heart was pounding, and her hands were suddenly cold, but something unreal and yet irresistible was sweeping her with it. There was once a queen. She opened the screen door before Henry Davis had time to knock. She extended her hand cordially. She was smiling. "Well, how do you do, Mr. Davis? Come right in. I'm real glad to see you. Been quite a while since you was over." Henry looked surprised, with very much embarrassment. "Why, no, now, I won't go in. I'll just stop to see John on a little matter of business. I'll just—" You'll just come right in. John will be in from milking in a few minutes, and you can talk while you eat, both of you. I've supper just ready. Now step right in, Mr. Davis." As Jenny moved aside, a warm, fragrant breath of fried ham and biscuits seemed to waft itself to Henry Davis's nostrils. There was a visible softening of his features. "Why, no, I didn't reckon on anything like this. I owed I'd just speak to John and then be getting on." "They'll see you at home when you get there," Jenny put in quickly. "You never tasted my hot biscuits with butter and quince honey, or you wouldn't take so much coachin'." Henry Davis came in and sat at the big, clean, warm kitchen. His eyes took in every detail of the orderly room, the clean cloth, the shining lamp, the neat sink, the glowing stove. Jenny saw him relax comfortably in his chair. Then, above the aromas of the food about her, she detected the strange sweetness of the bit of white linen she had tucked away in the bosom of her dress. It rose to her as a haunting sense of her power as a woman. She smiled at Henry Davis, smiled as she would never have thought of doing a day ago. Then she would have spoken to him with a drawn face full of subservient fear. Now, though the fear clutched her heart, her lips smiled sweetly, moved by that unreality that seemed to possess her. There was once a queen. "And how are things going with you, Mr. Davis?" she asked with a blithe upward reflection. Henry Davis was very human. He had never noticed before that Jenny's hair was so thick and pretty, and that she had such pleasant ways. Neither had he dreamed that she was such a good cook, and the sight and smell of the supper things would indicate. He was very comfortable there in the big, sweet-smelling kitchen. He smiled back. It was an interesting experiment on Henry's part, for his smiles were rare. "Oh, so. How are they with you?" Jenny had been taught to speak the truth, but at this moment there dawned in her a mind, a vague understanding that the high loyalties of life are, after, relative and not absolute. She smiled again as she skillfully flipped a great slice. "This is not a cold. I'm just sniffling a little at the story, so don't panic." She smiled again as she skillfully flipped a great slice of golden brown ham over in the frying pan. "Why, just fine, Mr. Davis. We're getting on just fine, John and me. It's been hard sledding, but I sort of think the worst is over. I think we're going to come out way ahead now. We'll just be proud to pay off that mortgage so fast come another year. Then you'll be surprised." It was said. Jenny marveled that the words had not choked her, had not somehow smitten her dead as she spoke them. But their effect on Henry Davis was amazingly good. "That's so?" he asked in surprise. "Well, now that's fine. I always wanted to see John make a success at the old place, but somehow, well, it didn't look like anything. Well, that is, there's been some talk around that maybe John wasn't getting along any too good. A man has to sort of watch his investments. Well, now I'm glad things are picking up a little." Jenny felt as though a tight hand at her throat had relaxed. She spoke brightly of the fall weather and the crops as she finished setting the dishes on the table and rang the bell for John. There was delicate work yet to be done when he came in. Little Jim had to be sent to hasten him before he finally appeared. He was a big man, John Musgrave, but big and slow-moving and serious. He had known nothing all of his life but hard physical toil. Heaviness had pitted his great body against all the adverse forces of nature. There was a time when he had felt that strength, such as his, was all any man needed to bring him fortune. Now he was not so sure. The brightness of that faith was dimmed by experience. John came to the kitchen door with his eyebrows drawn. Little Jim had told Jim that Henry Davis was there. He came into the room with as an accused man faces the jury of his peers, faces the men who, though the same flesh and blood as he, and yet somehow curiously in a position to save him or destroy him. John came in and then stopped, staring blankly at the scene before him, at Jenny moving about the bright table, chatting happily with Henry Davis, at Henry himself, his sharp features softened by an air of great satisfaction, at the sixth plate on the white cloth. Henry staying for supper! But the silent deeps of John's nature served him well. He made no comment, merely shook hands with Henry Davis, and then washed his face at the sink. Jenny arranged the savory dishes, and then sat down to supper. It was an entirely new experience to John to sit at the head of his own table and serve a generously heaped plate to Henry Davis. It sent through him a sharp thrill of sufficiency, of equality. He realized that before he had been cringing in his soul at that very sight of this man. Henry consumed 8 biscuits richly covered with quince honey, along with the heavier part of his dinner. Jenny counted them. She recalled hearing the Davises did not set a very bountiful table. It was common talk that Mrs. Davis was even more miserly than her husband. But however that was, Henry now seemed to grow more and more genial and expansive as he ate. So did John. By the time the pie was set before them, they were laughing over a joke Henry had heard at the Grange meeting. Jenny was bright, watchful, careful. If the talk lagged, she made a quick remark. She moved softly between table and stove, refilling the dishes. She saw to it that a hot biscuit was at Henry Davis's elbow just when he was ready for it. All the while there was arising within her a strong zest for life that she would have deemed impossible only that morning. This meal, at least, was perfect success. An achievement of any sort, whatever had been few. Henry Davis soon left after supper. He brought the conversation around awkwardly to his errand as they rose from the table. Jenny was ready. "I told him, John, that the worst is over. Now we're getting on fine," she laughed. "I told him we'd be swamping him pretty soon with our payments. Ain't that right, John?" John's mind was not analytical. At that moment he was comfortable. He has been host at a delicious supper with his ancient adversary, whose sharp face marvelously softened. Jenny's eyes were shining with a new and amazing confidence. It was a natural moment for unreasoning optimism. "Why, that's right, Mr. Davis. I believe we can start clearing off this now pretty soon. If you could just see your way clear to renew the note, maybe." It was done. The papers were back in Davis's pocket. They had bid him a cordial good-bye from the door. "Next time you come, we'll have biscuits for you, Mr. Davis," Jenny called daringly after him. "Now don't you forget that, Mrs. Musgrave. That certainly ain't hard to eat," he said. He was gone. Jenny cleared the table and set the shining lamp in the center of the oilcloth covering. She began to wash the dishes. John was fumbling through the papers on a hanging shelf. "I believe I'll do a little figuring since I've got time tonight. It just struck me that maybe if I used my head a little bit more I might get on faster." "Well, now you might," said Jenny. It would not be John's way to comment just yet on their sudden deliverance. She polished 2 big Rambo apples and placed them on the saucer beside him. He looked pleased. "Now that's what I like," he grinned. Then, making a clumsy clutch at her arm, he added, "Say, you look sort of pretty tonight." Jenny made a brisk, coquettish business of freeing herself. "Oh, go along with you," she returned, smiling and starting in again upon the dishes, but a hot wave of color had swept up in her shallow cheeks. John had looked more grateful over her setting those 2 apples beside him now than he had the last fall when she lifted all the potatoes by herself. Men were strange, as the woman in gray had said. Maybe even John had been needing something else more than he needed the hard, back-breaking work she had been doing. She tidied up the kitchen and put the children to bed. It seemed strange to be through now, ready to sit down. All summer they had worked outdoors till bedtime. Last night she had been slaving over apple butter until she stopped, exhausted, and John had been working in the barn with the lantern. Tonight seemed so peaceful, so quiet. John still sat at the table, figuring while he munched his apples. His brows were not drawn now. There was a new purposeful light upon his face. Jenny walked to the doorway and stood looking through the darkness and through the break in the trees at the end of the lane. Bright and golden lights kept glittering across it, breaking dimly through the woods, flashing out strongly for a moment, and then disappearing behind the hill. Those were the lights of the happy cars that never stopped in their swift search for far and magical places. Those were the lights of the highway which she had hated. But she did not hate it now, for today it had come to her at last and left her with some of its mysterious pleasure. Jenny wished as she stood there that she could somehow tell the beautiful stranger in the gray coat that her words had been true, that she, Jenny, insofar as she was able, was to be like her and fulfill her woman's part. For while she was not figuring as John was doing, yet her mind had been planning, sketching in details, strengthening itself against the change of old habits, resolving on new ones, seeing with sudden clearness where they had been blundered, where they had made mistakes that far-sighted, orderly management could have avoided. But how could John have sat down to figure in comfort before, in the kind of kitchen she had been keeping? Jenny bit her lip. Even if some of the tomatoes spoiled, if all of them spoiled, there would be a snowy washing on her line tomorrow. She would be ironing the next day in her clean kitchen. She could sing as she worked. She used to when she was a girl. Even if the apples rotted on the trees, there were certain things she knew now that she must do regardless of what John might say. It would pay her better in the end, for she had read the real needs of his soul from his eyes that evening. Yes, wives had to choose for their husbands sometimes. A thin, haunting breath of sweetness rose from the bosom of her dress where the scrap of white linen lay. Jenny smiled into the dark, and tomorrow she would take time to wash her hair. It used to be yellow, and she wished she could see the stranger once more, just long enough to tell her she understood. As a matter of fact, at that moment, many miles along the sleek highway, a woman in a gray coat with soft gray hat and a rose quill leaned suddenly close to her husband as he shot the high-powered car through the night. Suddenly he glanced down at her and slackened the speed. "Tired?" he asked. "You haven't spoken a word for miles. Shall we stop at the next town?" The woman shook her head. "I'm all right, and I do love to drive at night. It's only, that poor woman on the farm. I can't get over her wretched face and the house and everything. It was hopeless." The man smiled down at her tenderly. "Well, I'm sorry, too, if it was all as bad as your description. But you mustn't worry. Good gracious, darling, you're not weeping over it, I hope." She sniffed. "No, truly, just a few little tears. I know it's silly, but I did so want to help her, and I know now that what I said must have sounded perfectly insane. She wouldn't know what I was talking about. She just looked up with that blank, tired face, and it all seemed so impossible. No, no, I'm not going to cry. Of course I'm not. But lend me your handkerchief, will you, dear? I've lost mine somehow." Ladies, I didn't bring my handkerchief with me, and I didn't expect it to be so emotional, so I've got to go and get a Kleenex. So thank you for watching, please, and listening. Please leave a comment. Goodbye.